left off talking about edge effects. Edge effects are the boundaries between one habitat to another. So, one ecosystem to another. And the term that you need to know related to that is ecotone. So, unfreeze. At least you told me before we got too much further in. And now it's forever immortalized because I'm recording this, so it's great. So, ecotone. What's an ecotone? Do you remember? I said it yesterday. I know. All the words.
Ecotone is what you said?
Yep. Okay, it's the term for the boundary between communities that are right next to each other, or the place where transition occurs between different habitats or different communities. So we would have an ecotone from a forest to an open field. There would be an ecotone from a lake to a forest. There's ecotone from the river to the forest. There's ecotone from the river to an open field. Okay, all of those different habitats have ecotones. So those boundary lines can have completely different characteristics, or characteristics that are like resembling both of the communities that it spans between. Okay. The reason this is important, the reason edge effects matter, is that as we settle into habitats and ecosystems where there have been no humans, and then humans start to disturb the area, we fragment the habitat that's there. So it's called habitat fragmentation. And that's a huge deal for some species, because some species can't survive in an area that looks like this. So this area is all spread out. It's got a total area of 50 hectares, which is another unit of measurement. Like an acre is a unit of measurement, hectares is another unit of measurement. This also has 50 hectares, but it's got this area in the middle called the core area. So this core area has different characteristics than what's on the edge. And some species only survive well in a core area. So if there is no core area, they're going to be stressed because their tolerance limits or their tolerance levels don't handle the edge areas very well, and they're not going to survive as well as they should. So with habitat fragmentation, when this takes place, something that scientists think that we should do is preserve bigger blocks that look like this, and then if there is another block farther away that you want organisms to be able to get to, you need to leave a migration corridor so species can travel through it to get to the other area safely. But people don't generally think about that when they cut down a bunch of trees so that they can plant corn or other crops. Okay. We're getting close. 4.4, so we're almost there. This is a beautiful, wonderful, lovely chart that kind of talks about succession. Do you remember learning about succession in biology? Maybe? Maybe not. You've heard the word. Okay, do you remember hearing about what a climax community is?
No.
Okay. We used to think, and this is like in the 1800s, a couple of ecologists said, okay, this climax community is the oldest or most mature community that can exist in a habitat. So if you start with bare rock, then your first community, your pioneer species or your pioneer community, is going to actually be creating soil. So it's breaking the rock down and forming soil. So that's things like lichens and mosses that can grow on rock, that will help break the rock down over time with chemical and physical weathering. We're throwing back to soils and geology. After that, then you get grasses and herbs and shrubs. Small trees start to grow. Then you get specific types of trees that are able to grow in the soil that's present. And then as the soil pH increases, then the soil becomes better suited for a coniferous forest. So you get things like this that are able to grow better in a more acidic soil, as opposed to the trees that grew earlier. So this is the idea of here's primary succession. We start with bare rock, and then we get to this final end community. So hypothetically, according to this theory, the climax community is kind of the end result of development and growth if you leave the system untouched. We don't necessarily think that that's the case anymore, and there are some types of communities that have to be disturbed in order to maintain the community the way that it is. So grasslands like savannas and steppes are an example of that. Those rely on there being periodic fires. And if there aren't fires to kill off the trees and shrubs that would start to grow, then you end up having trees take over the grassland. So it's not a grassland anymore, then it eventually becomes a forest, hypothetically. Okay.
Necessarily be a good thing.
Not necessarily, because there are a lot of species that only live in grassland. So if the grassland disappears, where are they going to go? Okay.
It would turn to become a forest, right?
What?
It would become a forest.
It would become a forest, but the organisms that rely on it to be a grassland can't live in a forest. So there are organisms like elephants. Remember we talked about keystone species? Elephants are an example of a keystone species because in the grasslands where they live, they clear out vegetation. So they trample or eat or pull up shrubs and trees and things like that to keep them from growing. So it helps maintain that system the way that it is. That's not humans disturbing it, but it is animals disturbing it. And we have records of Native American tribes for years and years and years who would set fires on purpose on the grasslands here in the United States to keep the area as a grassland because they recognized that that was helpful for the horses that they caught and used, and for the other herds of things that they hunted from, like buffalo and bison. Buffalo and bison being the same thing, in case you didn't know that. Two different words for the same thing. So that's the idea of a primary succession. You start from bare rock or like sand. Secondary succession is any time you have progression that takes place after a disturbance has occurred. So after a fire, that would be secondary succession. After a flood, then you'd have secondary succession. So secondary succession usually means that you're not starting from bare rock. You're probably starting from either there's soil and stuff just needs to start to grow, or maybe you still have some tall trees, but then there's a lot of open space for grasses and smaller things to start to grow as well. Okay, so you should know the difference between primary and secondary succession. You should generally know kind of the stages of primary succession. So the things on this figure, you should kind of know this order. You don't have to know specifics, you don't have to name these specific types, but you should know in general you have trees that are able to grow more quickly, and then you have trees that will do better in a higher pH. The term pioneer species then you should also know, so this is the first things that are able to survive and start to grow on bare rock. So it's not just lichens and mosses, it can also be bacteria, so other types of microbes. And then a disturbance can be beneficial. I mentioned the savannas and grasslands, having those types of fires are beneficial. You should be able to give a couple of examples of disturbances. So let's say one that's not beneficial and one that is. As another example of one that can be beneficial though, we're learning that flooding is actually necessary for floodplains as well, to maintain their health and maintain their habitat. So occasionally flooding is a good thing. So the way that we have managed land is starting to change, looking at trying to keep the whole health of the whole area and not just what's best for humans who want to maybe build houses or businesses in an area that might flood. So different perspectives and different priorities there. And you can debate which one you think is right. Okay. That's pretty much it for the rest of this. There's this term here. You don't necessarily have to know it, but I think it makes sense. So disturbance adapted species. These are species that do well even if there is a disturbance. And they tolerate them well, but sometimes they might also require a disturbance. So there's a species of, I think it's a pine tree, that will only be able to grow its seeds if the seeds are exposed to a fire. So you guys know what pine seeds are in, right? Pine cones, okay? Which, hopefully you guys have all seen a pine cone before. But these pine cones are so close together. There we go. They're so close together and tight, the seeds don't fall out on their own. The only way that they open up is if they're exposed to heat. So that heat is usually something that's generated by a fire in the area. So there has to be fire to open up those pine cones so that the seeds can fall out so that new trees can grow. So they require fire, which is a type of disturbance, just like the savannas and grasslands require fire in order to stay as savannas and grasslands. Cool?